Thank you for joining me tonight for the March Madness forecast. This is Denise Hancock of Astrology with Denise. I don't typically do a monthly webinar for forecasts. As you know, I just send newsletters most of the time. But there is so much going on in the month of March that I thought it was worthwhile to do a little bit more of a deep dive. And if you're here live, you can also ask me questions through the presentation using the chat box, or you can unmic yourself and speak if you want to. I'll also have some time once I finish with the content if you have any personal chart questions, because I'm happy to do that. I have 30 minutes or so afterward. So today is February the 18th of 2025, and since February is a short month, we are really only 10 days away until we get to March. So welcome to March Madness. Before I dive completely into the month of March, I thought I would just kind of zoom back a minute. If you participated in my year ahead webinar, you know that there's three big themes that I'm looking for the year of 2025 and really carrying us into 2026. And these three big themes are, one, that the pace of change actually accelerates, and we start seeing even bigger, even faster shifts in technology, spiritual movements, and cultural values and mores and norms. The second one is that many of the systems and structures that we have come to rely upon literally dissolve. We're already seeing that happen very much at some of the political and economic levels and also among society. And the third one is the creation of new forms, particularly artistic movements, trends in fashion, in architecture. And these things are inspired by the larger planetary cycles like Jupiter and Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and kind of harken us back to beginnings of bigger cycles that started in the 1890s, the 1960s, and 1989. So March is going to sort of push us in to that bigger theme of 2025 and 2026. And so you may remember that I really talked about January and February this year of being hard to make any progress, that it's not so much that it's sluggish, but that it's like we're still stuck in these patterns that started in the fall of 2024. Through Jupiter, Saturn square, through the Mars retrograde, we're very much revisiting things that began in the fall of 2024 and kind of seeing the repercussions of those things. And so it's been really hard for most people that I talk to make any sort of progress. It just seems like there's so much uncertainty, there's so much turmoil, decisions aren't being made. The decisions that we thought were made are turned to mush, and it's really hard to see clearly. So what happens in March is that things start changing really fast. And I know that that is hard to believe because it seems like external events, like we're getting news stories and messages all the time, but bigger changes come much more dramatically. And many of the outer planets start moving into new signs, starting with Neptune at the end of March, then Saturn in May, Jupiter in June, Uranus in July. And so as these planets change signs, we're going to sort of find ourselves facing different situations, different issues than we've all been dealing with on a personal and a collective basis. The month of September is, I think, another sort of turning point like March. It's an eclipse season like March, and will be a time period when we either have to consolidate things or face some new crisis. And then the latter part of the month will be much more of a slowing back down, looking backwards, a time for introspection, healing, and planning. So that's kind of the overview of how we step into March. Now, I'm only going to put this slide up for a minute because we will be going back to it, and I'm going to walk you through some of the March transits one at a time. But I think it's helpful to start with March by looking at the new moon that takes place on February 27th, because that kicks us off into the new 28-day lunar cycle and really opens up what I call eclipse season. So eclipse season, I believe, starts with the lunation before the new or full moon that's before the first eclipse. And then there's a second eclipse 2 weeks later, and then there's another 2 weeks before the next lunation. So I would say this is a good 6-week period. So February 27th, we have a new moon at Pisces. And then on March 1st, the very first day of the month, Venus retrogrades in Aries. There's not a lot going on in the first full week of March. Then once we get to week 2, week 3, and week 4, things really start picking up. The second week of the month, we're going to have a very long void moon, and I'll talk for just a second about what that means. Mercury is going to be conjunct Venus in Aries. As Mercury moves into Aries, it's moving pretty quickly. The sun will meet Saturn in Pisces. We'll get into our first eclipse on March 14th. Then Mercury goes retrograde. So yes, you heard that right. Venus and Mercury will be retrograde in March. The third week, we'll have another really long void moon. The sun meets Neptune in Pisces, and then the sun goes into Aries. So you can already tell we've got a lot of action in Aries. The sun's going to meet Venus, then it's going to meet Mercury. We have another really long void moon. Then Venus actually backtracks all the way back into Pisces where it runs into Neptune. We have another eclipse. Mercury backs into Pisces and meets Neptune. And then finally, Neptune gets into Aries with another void moon. And I only put the big moves on here, right? There's still some other smaller day-to-day transits. There's some sextiles, a couple of squares. But for the most part, what we're feeling in March is very much about blending energy as the sun and Mercury and Venus and Neptune all come together. So what I've put on the screen now is that chart, the February 27th new moon. And you can see on the screen over to the right-hand side, there are so many planets piled up in Pisces. At 1 degree, we have Ceres, who's a dwarf planet like Pluto that represents kind of an Earth Mother archetype. We have the moon, sun, Saturn, Mercury, the north node of the moon, and Neptune, all just loaded up into Aries or in Pisces. Many of those planets will be moving into Aries very shortly, but for now, a heavy dose of Pisces in the sky. And so the sense that we're kind of in this collective overwhelm, that we're like being flooded with messages and maybe we still don't have clarity, that's really how we start the month. The good news is, I think, that by the new moon, Mars has been retrograde in Cancer since the first of the year. And just before the new moon, Mars turns direct. So at this new moon, Mars is still in Cancer, another water sign. It's still moving very slowly, but it is going forward now. And so I think as we get into March, some of you who've talked to me about long-standing aggravating situations, you'll start to see like some cleanup and some healing and some turnaround, that things are starting to, come to resolution. So that leads us then into March. Now, I walked you through day by day some of the transits, but really as I looked at these, there were 3 major themes that just kind of struck me as I think about what is the mood of March and what to expect. And I jokingly call the first theme conjunction junction. And it's what I've already mentioned, that Mercury moves into Aries and goes retrograde in Aries and back to Pisces. Venus retrogrades in Aries. And so essentially we have several meetings of the planet Mercury, which is all about messages, news, information, also having to do with like children and school system, the education, transactions and trading. We have Venus, the planet of love and desire and what's attractive and our social values and our relationships and our connections. Peace, We have the sun that's all about leaders and spirit and purpose and will. And Neptune, the planet of, the ocean, of universal consciousness, of compassion. These four planets are really just blending their energies together back and forth for several meetings in the month. So it's like everything kind of becomes almost like what we call a gumbo in New Orleans, right? It's like all these ingredients that are kind of muddling around in the sign of Pisces and the sign of Aries. So that leads me to the second theme, which is that we have a real hot spot in the zodiac. It's going to, like, all this conjunction junction activity is taking place between the 26th degree of Pisces and the 11th degree of Aries. So there's about a 15-degree slice of the sky where these planets are just blending and going back and forth. So if you have any personal planets or angles like your rising sign or your midheaven, particularly if your sun, your moon, your Mercury, your Venus, your Mars, if those are between 26 Pisces and 11 Aries, then what's happening in March is really going to be personal for you. And I would say the same thing is true if you have planets that are opposite that, between 26 Virgo and 11 Libra, or square to that. And so we can talk about more chart questions later, but there's just so much going on in that very small section of the sky. The third real theme, besides all the conjunctions and the hotspot, is that we kind of have erratic lighting going on in the month of March. We like to think that the sun is super reliable. Every day it comes up, it rises, goes across the sky, it sets in the west. And then the moon is predictable. It waxes, it wanes, it goes through a cycle, it translates to us the messages from other planets. But what's happening in March with the two eclipses and these long void moon periods are like messages from the sun and the moon kind of aren't getting through, or the sun and moon are being like blacked out, which can result in things like power surges or power outages. And we'll talk more about the specific eclipses, but those are the three big themes I see for March. Conjunction junction, a hot spot in late Pisces to early Aries, and erratic behavior from our lights, the sun and the moon. So let's start first with the Venus retrograde, since it's really launching us off into the month of March 1st. Venus is going to go retrograde on March 1st at the 11th degree of Aries, and she'll backtrack into Pisces and finally end that retrograde at the 25th degree of Pisces. Now, there's something called the shadow period, and what that essentially means is when Venus first crosses 25 Pisces, and then when she finally gets past the 11th degree of Aries. And so when you consider that shadow period and the retrograde period, Venus is really spending almost 4 months in that very narrow sliver of the sky. And Venus actually has repeated this pattern about every 8 years. So if you're wanting to know, like, what does this Venus retrograde in Aries mean for me, you can look back at the spring of 2017, the spring of 2009, or the spring of 2001, and think about what happened in your own life. In the news itself and the world around us, Venus retrogrades in Aries often have to do with issues around women's rights, or just women's issues related to sexuality, childbearing, birth control, household stuff. Women that are strong-willed who are in the news. Scandals, often either sexual scandals or some sort of scandals where someone's been breaking the social norms. Recently, Chris Brennan and Nick Dagenbest did a wonderful, long episode specifically about Venus retrogrades in Aries throughout history. It's 7.5 hours if you really want to learn about this topic. But some things they found are a lot of times events happen during this period which very much have a Aries theme. Aries planets, they want to be first and they want to be fastest. So a lot of times we see things that happen for the first time or things that happen very quickly or about the topic of speed. There's oftentimes also a lot of civil unrest, whether that's literal war activity, breaking treaties, protests, and strikes, because it's like people are ready to speak out, they're ready to act up. Sometimes there's changing consensus about what is okay socially and what's not. Also, big comebacks and big falls from grace, so particularly affecting people like leaders and celebrities. So those will be some fun news stories to watch out for. And I feel like we've already been getting hints of these since Venus has gone into Aries a couple of weeks ago. Now, this doesn't happen until later in the month, but I told you we're also going to have a Mercury retrograde. The Mercury retrograde doesn't start until March 15th. However, on March 1st, that shadow period started. And on March 3rd, Mercury goes into Aries. And so essentially, Mercury is going to spend 2 months in that same very narrow slice of the sky, right? Between 27 Pisces and 10 Aries. Now, we have Mercury retrogrades 3 times a year very regularly. And so certainly Mercury and Aries can have things that happen more quickly, more loudly, more aggressively. But you might watch for news stories around like children, education issues, transportation, travel concerns, systems and networks, and the managing of data, and also communications. The other sort of implication for both of these retrogrades that I didn't put on the slide, but the personal level, a lot of times you may find that people from your past reappear during a Venus or a Mercury retrograde. It might be friends, it might be a lover, it might be like relationships with your siblings, but there may be something about relationships from the past which resurface. Could be something like a text or a phone call or a social media message, or maybe you take a trip and you're like revisiting nostalgic memories, but those things are possible too. I would say the usual advice for Mercury retrogrades applies, that you want to make sure that you back up your files, anything important, maybe you print it out, you save it twice. You can kind of do some preparation for yourself to make sure that you double check, confirm, and prepare for anything that could go wrong related to travel, related to data processing, related to messaging, publishing, those kinds of issues. So I mentioned that early on we have a void moon. And in fact, March is really unusual. In the average calendar year, we might have 4 or 5 periods when the moon is void of course for a long time. And when I'm talking about the term void moon, there's actually many ways a moon can be defined as void, and I'm using a traditional or Hellenistic definition, which is the most extreme, which says the moon is not making any major aspects to a planet for a full 30 degrees. And so by major aspects, I'm talking about conjunctions, sextiles, trines, squares, or oppositions. And I'm talking specifically about the original 7 traditional planets, so Sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, or Saturn. So interestingly, in the month of March, we've got 4 different periods where the moon is void, not making any aspects to these planets for more than 2 days. That's really unusual. Like I said, usually we might have 4 of those a year, and we get 4 in March. There's going to be 1 more later in 2025. So what does that mean? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've heard astrologers say when the moon is void, essentially nothing comes of it. And so the theory behind that is the moon is our satellite here on Earth, right? And what the moon does is it's our translator. It goes between us and the sun, us and the other planets, and it kind of carries the light or the energies or the vibrations from planets and stars in the sky down to Earth. So if the moon's not talking to anyone, then we have like a communication gap. We have this wandering moon who is not in conversation, and therefore we're not getting messages down here on Earth. So what you may find on a really practical level is during these void moon periods, situations just lose momentum. I can't tell you how many times that I've had like somebody email me or call me with some kind of emergent crisis situation when I was in leadership roles. They want something right now. They have a problem they want to solve. And somehow, if it happens during a void moon period, it's like it just dissipates and disappears. Whatever the crisis was, it's resolved on its own, it goes away. Whatever the big request was, somehow the person solves it or there's no need for it. So we find that things lose momentum, steps can be missed. There can also just be unexpected delays. So something you would normally expect to happen very quickly when the moon is void, maybe it doesn't happen for a couple days or it doesn't happen at all, or things can happen without any real signs of cause and effect. Now, some astrologers say that when the moon is in Cancer, Taurus, Sagittarius, or Pisces, the moon is actually stronger, and so void moons may have less of an impact. And that actually is the case for a couple of days when we get to later in the month. Athena decided she wanted to join us. Hi, Athena. She's going to pop in and be my oracle while we continue to go through the March madness forecast. So our first void moon happens on March the 10th. And really, it's going to last for 60 hours almost. So March 10th, 11th, and 12th are dates that I would mark on my calendar as being a time when, if people bring to you a crisis or a request, or they suddenly need to change something, it might be worthwhile just to sit on it because it might be things that just resolve on their own. So then the next really big event we have after Mercury meets Venus in Aries and the Sun meets Saturn is the full moon / lunar eclipse that's taking place on March the 14th at almost 2 in the morning. And the part of the zodiac it's taking place is the 24th degree of Virgo. And this is what we call a south node eclipse. So one of the questions I usually get from people is, well, can I see it? And the answer to this one is yes. If you are in North America and you want to stay up the night of March 13th into March 14th, then yes, it will be visible all across North America. And it should peak if you're on Central Time just before 2 a.m. This is not a total lunar eclipse, so it won't be as dramatic as some of the ones we've had in the last couple of years. You'll probably just see the moon change to a shade of red, but you absolutely can stay up and watch it. You'll notice the image I have on the screen is a big drain. And the reason I chose that image is because this is a south node eclipse. The south node is a place of release. And so you can think about it as a drain, a time when oftentimes things are released or they have to be let go of. And that's happening in the sign of Virgo. And so if you have any planets or important things in your chart, kind of in the last 10 degrees of Virgo, then this might be a really personal eclipse for you. And because it's in Virgo, a sign that's very conscientious, very concerned with material things, it makes me think of letting go of perfectionism, letting go of the need to know, having to release maybe some of our attachment to having plans, which is not an easy person for which is not an easy thing for a person like me. I don't know about you. Here's the chart for the lunar eclipse, just in case you're interested. And what you see here is that some of the planets in Pisces have moved out since the new moon, but we still have in Pisces Ceres, Saturn, the Sun, and the north node of the moon, and Neptune. And the eclipse is taking place in Virgo. So it's these red lines directly across where you see the moon in Virgo is next to the south node of the moon. And if we've never talked about it before, you can always tell from a chart when there's an eclipse because it's a full or new moon that happens within like 12 to 15 degrees of those lunar nodes. And so it's very predictable. But at this point in time, we also do have Venus and Mercury in Aries. Venus is moving backwards. Mercury will be the very next day. So it's moving very, very slowly at this lunar eclipse. Here's just a few notes I wrote for you about the lunar eclipse to give you some more perspective about how it might impact you and what to be looking for in the world around us. Virgo is a sign that is ruled by Mercury. Each planet, except for the sun and moon, has essentially two zodiac signs that they are the boss of, that they're in charge of. And as I just said, this sign is ruled by Mercury, and Mercury is super, super slow and turning retrograde on March 15th at 10 Aries. And so there's kind of a lot of sluggishness with this sign of Virgo and any planets that are in Virgo right now. Lunar eclipses can pretty much be thought of as a power surge or a power outage going into different parts of the chart. Most likely, this will come as some kind of an outage in the Virgo part of the chart. Virgo, when you're talking about the collective level, it's very much associated with the working sector, working people, jobs, employment and unemployment, healthcare, hospitals, all kinds of healthcare and social services. It's also an earth sign, so it's associated with agriculture and the food system, and it's associated with technology and data systems. And so it's entirely possible that we might see disruptions or problems that happen in those Virgo parts of the economy. It can also, because it's opposite Pisces, affect Pisces topics. And those would be things like water, large bodies of water like the ocean, oil, petroleum, pharmaceuticals, um, mental health and physical health, spiritual matters, sleep, and places and activities that are related to people in tough circumstances. So things like prisons, immigration, psych wards, the unhoused, etc. And so we may see some sort of a crisis or a new issue arrive in those areas. And I really love a book by Judith Hill about the eclipses. And she says that in Virgo, the eclipse impacts usually come to a head pretty quickly, between 1 week and 4 weeks before or after the eclipses. And so certainly I think there's already been signs and symptoms of issues arising in the working sector, particularly anything related to the government, to bureaucracy, to public health, to science. On the personal basis, when you think about how could you prepare for a Virgo eclipse, I would say around any eclipse, you may feel very tired. And so if you can do something to lighten your calendar, I would do that. Other things to think about for the month of March and all of eclipse season are to check your inventories at home, particularly making sure maybe that you have at least a 2 to 4 week supply of food. Check your boundaries, check your fences, check the structure of your property, and watch the health of animals. Back up any data, systems, and records, just like you would for Mercury retrograde. And you might expect that you might have changing situations around a boss or people that work for you or people that rent from you or in the institutions and borders that impact us all. If you have any health concerns, when there's a lunar eclipse in Virgo, it can cause fluctuation in blood sugar. So if you have diabetes or something else where glucose levels are important, you might pay a closer attention to that in the month of March. And do what you can to support your liver, pancreas, or digestive system. Lunar eclipses and Virgos are actually really good time to do things like cleansing, fasting, or just eat really lightly because Virgo is associated with the digestive system. I hope that is helpful. So the day following the lunar eclipse, Mercury goes retrograde at 10 Aries. And then March 16th, 17th, and 18th, we have another one of those really long void moons. On March 19th, the sun crosses Neptune, and the very next day it enters Aries. And this is what we call the Aries ingress. And so in astrology, the astrological new year starts around March 20th or 21st every year when the sun enters Aries. We consider Aries to be the very first sign in the zodiac, one of like forceful new beginnings. You know, it's like life emerging from the void. And so I'm not going to fully delineate this chart. There's definitely people who are mundane and world astrologers who can do a much better job of that than me. I just wanted to point out to you that astrologically it is important, and it's what has been used for centuries to sort of predict the collective horoscope for the year. And so the conditions that are in place on this Aries ingress at March 20th have a lot to say about our leaders, our government, the general state of the people, of trade, of economics, how we get along with nations around us. And so if you're interested, I'd be happy to send you some good links for people who really can give you a lot of great information about that. 2 days later, after the sun has entered Aries, it meets Venus because Venus is going backwards and the sun is going forward. And then we get into the last week of the month, which is really impactful. We have our final eclipse of the spring on March 29th. It's almost 6 o'clock in the morning, Central Time, at 9 Aries. This one won't be visible in North America unless you're in like New England and Canada, and then you only get just a little bit of it. So it's definitely not something that people in the US are, trying to go watch. And this one will be a North Node eclipse. Now, you might have noticed the North Node is in Pisces. However, we're still within that 12 to 15 degree window, right? And so the eclipse is actually taking place with the sun at 9 Aries. And the image I chose for this one is a huge surge of a wave, because where a south node eclipse is like a drain or release, the north node is like power moving in, where you may have new emphasis, new interest, big, surges in your life, something that suddenly has a new emphasis or a crisis for you. This is the chart for the solar eclipse, and you'll see we've got Mercury, the sun, and the moon in Aries, and we still have a pretty big lineup of planets in Pisces. However, on the very next day, Neptune will be moving into Aries, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So a few notes about the solar eclipse. Aries is ruled by Mars, and Mars has been retrograde in Cancer since the beginning of January. By February 24th, Mars turns direct, which is good news. But at the time of this eclipse, even though it's a month later, Mars is still moving really slowly. He hasn't picked up speed yet. And so he's moving very slowly, and he's still in Cancer. And this is not a great place for Mars. Mars doesn't have a lot of strength there. It's like you have this warrior who's trying to paddle, against the ocean, right? So just like with the previous eclipse, this place in Aries is kind of sluggish. We've got a ruler who's slow. We've got retrograding planets. And it's most likely to impact you if you have planets that are kind of between about 5 degrees Aries or about 15 degrees of Aries. And it tends to also be really strong and fast and sudden events that happen pretty quickly, up to 4 weeks before the eclipse or 4 weeks after. So what kind of things are you looking for? Well, you might just have a lot more energy. However, you might also have a lot less energy. It really depends on you and your chart. Things might seem to happen very fast. You may find either in yourself or the people around you that people are, it's like they get flashes of anger more quickly, or impatience or frustration. Tempers can really be hot, passionate. There is likely to be stories around military actions and fire, literal fires, wildfires. There can be a sudden rise or fall of leaders, as well as like announcements about new discoveries in science and medicine. One of the things this is really good for, and I hope that we'll get some stories around this, is that there can be new art forms or like new films, new music that suddenly just takes off. And any kind of expressive arts or exploration are great things to emerge during this Aries eclipse. And you probably noticed that some of these themes are similar to what I said about the Venus retrograde in Aries, because they both very heavily carry this Aries archetype. It can also impact Libra. And so there might be issues around relationships, legal issues, contracts, war and peace. At the personal level, some things you might think about are just like checking your home for fire hazards. I always keep a fire extinguisher in my kitchen. If you don't have one, you might get one, or you might just check your, your expiration and make sure it's still good. Change out your smoke alarms, your carbon monoxide detectives. It's not a time to play with electricity, play with explosives. There can also be a real tendency, again, I talked about people were more hot-tempered and impatient. So there tends to be a little surge in if a relationship has been on the brink, people might suddenly quit their job or leave a relationship. If you're a teacher or someone who works with children, you might really think about making sure that there's more outlets for physical exercise. And there's some other researchers who've looked at eclipses, like Bernadette Brady, and she talks about this eclipse as specifically being a very physically expressive eclipse. So people might be more prone to accidents or injuries, particularly if they rush things or they try to do things they've never done before. But it actually can be good to put in physical effort, to maybe spend more time at the gym, take some walks. Just, don't do anything that's like outside of your skill level, and be sure to use safety precautions. The other warning is it's a time when Mars and Mercury are both not doing well, there can really be a lot of people who are speeding or aggressively driving. So you might want to just give yourself more time and be a real defensive driver. And also avoid people who are heavy drinkers or even drinking yourself to excess, because people can just tend to overdo it. And this is kind of time when fights can break out. At the body level, the health concerns that Judith Hill associates with Aries are any kind of pressure systems in the body. And so if you're someone who's prone to high blood pressure, eclipse season can really amp that up in general, and this Aries eclipse even more so. It could be increases in a tendency for things like migraines, problems with glaucoma, any mental health issues. It can also affect the adrenals and hormonal balances and just sort of be provocative for heat and for fever. So the advice is you want to drink plenty of water and do things that are more like cooling and calming for your mind and your body. So that is our last eclipse, although I wouldn't technically call us out of eclipse season until we get to the next lunation in the month of April. But the next thing that happens is on March 30th, when Neptune enters Aries. Neptune takes 164, 165 years to go around the zodiac. So when it moves into a sign, it stays there for many years. So Neptune is essentially going to be in Aries until 2039. That's 14 years. Now, it will back out for a little bit this fall, and it'll slip back into Pisces for a few months. But then once it goes back into Aries early next year, we're in it until 2039. And so Neptune in Aries tends to have, and Neptune's moves in general, they tend to have big issues on generations and on world events. I wouldn't so much worry about Neptune in Aries in your personal birth chart unless it's making a contact, either a conjunction, a square, or an opposition to a personal planet. I find that that's when the outer planets like Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are most powerful, when they're essentially right on top of one of your birth chart placements or across or at a 90-degree angle. But it definitely will be something that changes the world around us. And if you want to get a sense of prior periods in history when Neptune was in Aries, the last time was 1861 to 1875, which, if you recall your history, was the United States Civil War. So really big Aries militia, warlike events in our own country. Before that, it was from 1370 to 1383, which we're probably not as familiar about, but the big war was called the 100 Years' War between England and France at that time. So Neptune in Aries historically, it's associated with things like rebellions, uprisings, and crusades. And it has to do with people who they have this big vision for what society should look like and how society should be. And they act on that. And sometimes that means acting aggressively, right? By splitting off amongst groups of people or taking over land. So the exciting things about that are that we might have really bold new paradigms or perceptions about what it means to be human, what it means to be a state or a nation, how we want to work together, what our values and our priorities are. I think it's also fantastic for bringing us a real sense of creative, inspirational, or spiritual fire. I have a feeling we're going to see lots of new forms of music, of dance, of theater, of fashion, and those kinds of things emerge with Neptune and Aries. And of course, it's not all going to happen on March 30th, but it will be interesting to sort of watch the news stories that day to see what hints we get about the next 14 years of our lives and what Neptune and Aries might mean for us. Saturn and Neptune have been together in the sign of Pisces now for about 2.5 years, since early 2023. And Saturn is also going to follow Neptune into Aries, but not until May. And so by the time we get to June 1st, both Saturn and Neptune will be into Aries. And by then, I feel like we're going to be getting much more of the full force of what this Saturn and Neptune in Aries transit may be about. So after Neptune moves into Aries, we have another void moon. And again, it's going to last for more than 2 days. However, the last two void moons we have, the one that's March 25th, 26th, 27th, and the one that's March 30th and 31st, will be those periods when the moon is in one of those signs, Pisces or Taurus, where it's a little bit stronger. So I'll be interested to see how those two periods compare to the earlier ones in the month on March 10th, 11th, and 12th, and March 16th, 17th, and 18th. And I'd encourage you do that too. Just take notes and see when these really long void moons happen, what does that mean in your life? What do you notice? Because we won't get another one until December of this year. And like I said, we usually only get 4 or 5 a year. So it's quite unusual that we're getting 4 in a single month. We've been through a lot in the last 42 minutes. As you can see, it's a really dynamic month in March. And with all the action on the edge of Pisces, where things are dissolving and falling apart, to the forceful new beginnings of Aries, there's going to be a lot of big events that happen really quickly. It does seem, given the history of Neptune in Aries, Venus retrograde in Aries, the eclipses in Aries and Virgo, that there is a pretty strong potential for military action in the world. I don't know how that'll impact the US, but certainly there's plenty of places where there's war and conflict and unrest. I think we're likely to see protests and strikes pick up in activity. And maybe that's something that you want to be a part of, or maybe it's something that you want to avoid. But do be mindful of it and think about your safety and your well-being and what your role is during this period of revolution. We may see some leaders rise really quickly or fall really quickly. And I think we'll also get news of new discoveries, new breakthroughs, and new innovations, whether it's technology, science, medicine, healthcare. And one of the things that I noted that I didn't speak about a whole lot earlier is that, of course, right now, you saw the charts. We have a ton of planets in Pisces, and we have Mars in Cancer. And so we have a lot of planets in the water element. However, when I looked at some of the older delineations of the eclipses, Virgo eclipses and Aries eclipses often forecast hot and dry weather to come and maybe even droughts. And Saturn and Neptune sort of carry that connotation as well. And so it made me wonder if after all the flooding and the hurricane activity we've had and the snows, that we may get into the spring and summer into very hot and dry weather. However, I will say that in the fall, October, November, December, Saturn and Neptune are going to move back into Pisces, and we'll also have several planets in Scorpio. And so we'll get a return of that very water heavy skies. And so overall, I just think that we're going to expect continued extreme weather events. So because of that, and then all the turmoil we have going on at the political and social levels, um, there's many different indicators that our systems and our labor markets are going to be disrupted. And so personally, I'm considering the following things as my priority, and I thought you might want to think about them too as we move into March in 10 days. I'm really taking stock of like what I have in the pantry and the freezer and my pet food. I think that conserving and maintaining essential resources could be really important, especially if, food systems are disrupted or there are strikes. I think this year in general is really important to develop community networks and participate in mutual aid so that you're not just taking care of yourself, but you're also checking on your neighbor and the people around you. For me, it's a year of kind of going back to learning about my community supported agriculture CSA boxes and checking out my farmers markets, which is something that I hadn't done for the last couple of years when I'd done a lot more traveling. So I'm really trying to check in and tune in more to what's available to me at the local level and also who might need help. I think it's also really important to regulate your nervous system, whatever that means for you. For me, it's about limiting my intake of news stories and social media, turning it off sometimes. It's about checking my sources and making sure that what I'm reading is actually fact. It's about spending time for me that's outside, like feet or butt on the ground, letting myself be outdoors in nature, spending a lot of time with my puppy and playing, meditation. I think that music and dance and movement in general can be really helpful to us with all the dynamic activity that's going on. So those are my final thoughts for you. I hope that this was helpful, and I thank you for joining me. At this point, I am happy to take any questions if you have about what to expect in March and even the year beyond.
Denise, I just want to say that blew my mind. There was so much material in there. I'm glad there's a recording because I have to break it down and listen to it piece by piece. That was a lot of information. So thank you so much.
Thank you for coming.
I'm just blown away, but that was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else I can do for anyone else before I log off for the evening? All right, we're hearing no questions. I will thank you for joining me, and you will get the recording emailed to you immediately after. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.